I understand why people would be opposed to rioting. Rioting is very dangerous, and it is very, at least on a surface level, unproductive. It makes sense that one would look at rioting and have a natural, instinctive, repulsive reaction to it. How could you not? I mean, things get on fire, everyone's running around, everyone's yelling. I mean, even if, and I'm trying to speak, I think, from the perspective of others, even if their underlying motivations are sympathizable, that doesn't change the fact that the actual act of rioting is generally, how do you say, unproductive. And it is unproductive, in a sense. But I want to introduce you guys maybe to an alternative way of thinking, okay? I may be an enlightened centrist position in between the I guess the normies who are just decrying the rioting and the like crazy lefties who are like, fuck yeah, rioting is based, awesome based. I'm here for the enlightened centrist take, okay? So first of all, I want to address what rioting does, okay? Rioting is usually bad. And when I say that, I don't mean the rioters are bad. I mean the actual act of engaging in rioting generally does harm to the world. I have in front of me a list of buildings that have been damaged or looted in the Minneapolis and St. Paul regions. This is probably no longer updated because I imagine a new one gets added every hour or so. God knows, maybe even faster than that. Quite a bit of stuff here. There's a lot of publicity going on right now for with regards to the burning down of the 3rd precinct and that Target and what have you, but a lot of buildings have been damaged. A lot of them. And a lot of these buildings are small businesses that are owned by people who are struggling just as much as anyone else doing the rioting, sometimes. Some of these properties are even residential, which is, as far as I'm concerned, inexcusable. And it sucks. And my intentions here are certainly not to defend any of the damage done to any of these individual buildings, though I will be defending damage done to the 3rd precinct building. My intention here is to open up this discussion with an acknowledgement of the fact that rioting does damage and harm. Can we acknowledge that? I think we can all agree on that. Now here's why it's based in Epic anyway. When I was in school, there was a researcher I was taught about called Durkheim. He was an early sociologist. And Durkheim had a unique opinion that differentiated him from a lot of other people who shared his field at the time. He believed that crime served a utility. He believed that crime had a purpose, it had a function. His argument was that crime's function was to reveal underlying antagonisms or human needs that were not being met by the system as it existed now. Let me give you an example. Now, crime was very different back in the 1800s than it is today. The way in which it was carried out, the extent to which it was carried out was very different. But think of it this way, okay? Back then it was a crime, and it's still a crime today, to dig up corpses for medical or scientific purposes. It's not legal. It's not, But back then, back in the 1800s, the standards for medical and scientific research were much lower and much less loosely regulated than they are today, meaning that it was while not legal, still a very much viable profession to grave rob, to find corpses that had died recently, to haul them into a sack, to carry them to research facilities, and then to have them do this for autopsies or medical research or what have you. But think about this from a different perspective, I suppose, than a police officer would. A police officer back in those days, or an investigator or a detective, would simply see a person grave robbing, they would arrest that person, and then presumably they would be, scalped. I don't know, what do you do in the 1800s? I don't fucking know. It's just a thing, a person, they do a bad thing, and then you punish them for the bad thing that they do. But Durkheim said, does the preponderance of this crime not suggest there is a need that is not being met? Does it not suggest that our medical and scientific systems are being supplied with an insufficient number of human corpses necessary to perform research? And it was through the recognition of stuff like this that we developed laws like the, what's the technical term? Like organ donors. Like if you die, your organs go to medical research. It was through this that we developed a stronger and more refined apparatus for making sure the needs of the medical and scientific communities were met. Even though the individual scientists and grave robbers who participated in this practice were arrested for doing so, if they were found out, of course, the fact that they did those things belied a need. This is how Durkheim liked to think about crime, and I think it's a very valuable way to think about crime too, because it shows us something. Like, for example, there's a lot of crime that goes on in the inner city. A lot of it. A lot of black-on-black crime. That's the thing that happens in America. A lot of it is drug and gang related. Usually, this is because of policies that stem from the current war on drugs. Why is all this crime taking place? The easy answer, the simplistic answer, the juvenile answer, is to look at it and say, these are bad men, bad culture, it's just bad, just punish them, lock them up, that we get the bad ones out, and then the good people can take back their neighborhood. It's a very simplistic answer. I think a more realistic answer is to recognize the reasons why there's such a preponderance of gang violence in these communities. Like, say, for example, what if you grow up in an environment where there are very few job opportunities and you're being saddled constantly with predatory debt? The only way for you to make enough money to meaningfully escape the cyclical poverty you were born into is to do something illegal. The most viable option, apart from, I guess, being a basketball star, for getting that much money is to participate in the drug trade. And if you're participating in the drug trade, if that's how you're making your money, then you need to defend your property. You need to defend the drugs that you buy from other sources and distribute, and that usually takes guns and it takes a crew. And if you have a crew and guns, and there's other people who have their own crew and guns, invariably violence happens. Now, I'm not defending the individual gang members here. You'll notice that at no point, I'm not freeing them of individual responsibility for their actions. I'm not saying that what they do is good. A lot of gang members are horrible fucking people. Like, really bad people. There are some gangs for whom it's practiced that admission into the gang requires you kill a civilian because it demonstrates loyalty. If you kill a civilian, you have to be with the gang now because you're on the police's list now. You have no choice but to go elsewhere. This is morally indefensible. I'm not defending them. I'm saying we get more out of their crime by recognizing it as a product of need than we do from just assigning immorality and condemnation to those people. And so the riots. Rioting belies a need. The riots that are taking place right now in Minneapolis are taking place because of long pent-up racial and class-oriented frustrations on the part of those who are taking to the streets. Happy populations don't riot. Unless we're talking about white people at sporting events, okay? Hey, listen, we're not talking about that. Generally speaking, happy populations don't riot. Ever. Why the fuck would they? I mean, really, really, really think about it, okay? In a world where there is no racial bias in the police, and a world where people experience more or less equal economic parity, and you hear a guy dies due to like a shitty cop, you're not gonna go outside and fucking burn down a Target because of that. Are you fucking kidding me? There's nowhere near the individual level of emotional investment in the death of one random person in your city is not sufficient to motivate hundreds or thousands of people to go out there and riot and loot. It's not possible. It doesn't work that way. There are underlying problems, and those problems existed before George Floyd was murdered. So George Floyd, in a way, is almost irrelevant to the riots. He's an instigatory factor, but is he the reason they're rioting? Not really. The underlying problems are the reason that they're rioting. And at this point, when we talk about riots, which I have again acknowledged are largely destructive affairs, and I completely agree with that, if we acknowledge that rioting is a sociological outcome following a certain set of social conditions, does it not make more sense to attempt to prevent future riots by impugning the conditions which led to the rioting than it does to impugn the rioters? The optics of the situation are essentially irrelevant. This is just a natural outcome of a set of conditions over which we've had control for centuries and have chosen to ignore. The people in the neighborhood of Minneapolis, the poor black folk, they know their police force is racist as fuck. They know they're being kept under the boot of economic disenfranchisement. This isn't news to them. But to the rest of the world, what do you see? You look at Minneapolis now and you see it on fire. But this is only the spark being lit to a powder keg that's being stacked for decades now. And I think, as far as I'm concerned, if we're to assign culpability, the fault ultimately lies on the part of everyone who was responsible for building up those social conditions, for leading things to the place that they are now. Now, I'm not taking away individual culpability, individual responsibility from any of the rioters or looters. Some of those looters are probably pieces of shit. I can say that because a lot of humans are pieces of shit, and statistically speaking, some of them are probably in that riot. That's just how it works. And invariably, the misdeeds of a small percentage of rioters and protesters usually ends up being extrapolated to the broader rioting group, and then the whole people, you see like one video of like a black kid with like a 2x4, like smacking a window and like running in to grab a TV, and that's what you think of the rioters, right? When most of them are actually just out there on the streets talking, communicating, and setting fire to police precincts, which I will be defending shortly. Is looting an inevitable outcome of rioting? In poor neighborhoods? Yes, 100%. Rioting on its own is a result of sociological discontent, but when it comes to looting, if you're in a poor neighborhood, if you spent your entire life barely being able to make your rent, and then things get like thrown off, absolutely. And in my personal opinion, to critique the optics or the behavior of the rioters is to implicitly condone the conditions that they were subjected to, because you are impugning them for a natural sociological consequence, which is very strange to me. Like, here's a question, for example. What if, let me think. What if, Trail of Tears. Imagine it's back 150 years ago, Trail of Tears, okay? Native Americans are being marched westward, real bad stuff. I mean, it was a genocide, it's real bad, okay? Don't do it again. Don't do the Trail of Tears again. But imagine that the Trail of Tears folks, they're starving, they don't have much water. Makes sense. And because they're starving to death on their genocidal march, a few of them end up looting and raiding, like, neighboring like white or American villages, I'm just throwing out an example, okay? I leave aside like history for a little bit. I'm just trying to think. So we have a set of people who are in a set of conditions. They're being marched westward and they're starving. And as a product of those two conditions, some American folk died and had their food taken. Who do we impugn for this? Who do we actually impugn for that functionally? Do we impugn the natives for engaging in that behavior, or do we impugn the people for putting the natives in a position where that was the only choice they had? Americans cry out in pain as they strike the minority. That's been a long-standing habit, I think. To stomp on someone and then complain about dirt on your shoe. It's, I think, a pretty long-standing pattern of behavior. That you can spend decades and centuries building up the systemic oppression, but when things finally spark off, then everyone comes to condemn the people who are angry about it. If you don't like riots, your goal should be to prevent them from happening. But condemning rioters doesn't prevent them from happening because optics are irrelevant when you've spent your entire fucking life subjected to systems of discrimination that have left you completely disempowered. They don't fucking care. You think some fucking 18-year-old black kid is gonna like spend his whole life being shit on by the police, no hope, no future, shit school, shit neighborhood, and then like things finally pop off and this kid's going to think like, oh, well, people aren't going to look very favorably upon this behavior. I'll just sit at home and watch as other people do the rioting and looting. Like, well, this didn't change anything. It's a very simplistic way of addressing these problems, you know? It reminds me a little bit of a debate that Destiny had with Sargon of Akkad a while back, where they were talking about the cause of crime in black neighborhoods. And Destiny was making the argument that impugning the poor responsibility or poor decision-making of black people is almost irrelevant. It's almost counterproductive, because you're shifting the blame away from the causes of that crime towards some perceived libertarian free will, like where we just blame people for the things they do, even if the things they do are a natural consequence of conditions they've been subjected to. Don't impugn the rioters. If you want to stop riots from happening, fix institutional racism, fix the mistreatment of black people by the police, fix economic disparities. That's what you can do. That'll fix it. That'll do it right there. That will genuinely do it. That will fix the problem. But when you just sit here and you condemn the protesters, and that's all you do, you know, like, oh, well, the racism is bad, but protesting isn't productive. Productivity is irrelevant to them. Imagine, I used this example last night, but imagine if, like, if you're like a mom, I guess. Just imagine. I know, you know, we got some moms watching. I don't know. Imagine you're a mom, and you have like a boyfriend. And your boyfriend beats the shit out of your kid. It's your kid. Boyfriend just beats the fuck out of your kid. Abusive as all shit. Physical, emotional, just bad as it comes, you know? One of these days, the kid's 13 now, finally has enough of it, swings at the dad, or swings at the boyfriend, sorry. Finally runs off and decks the guy. 13-year-old boy can throw a pretty nice roundhouse, you know? That gives nice big bruise on the abuser's face. Imagine you as the mom coming up to the boy after being silent this entire time and saying, hey, listen, I get that what my boyfriend is doing is wrong, but that's not very productive. You probably shouldn't be doing that. Fucking excuse me? What? That's how you're involving yourself in this situation? That's your engagement here? You're gonna sit quiet for fucking decades. And then the swing back, that's when you suddenly have a moral objection to what's taking place. That's when it suddenly becomes a poor optical decision. The reason riots are poor optically is because of fuckers like you, people who elevate this poor optics discourse. If every single person out there who was saying, well, I agree police racism is bad, but we should still not do rioting because it looks bad. If all those people would just shut the fuck up and support the protesters, this would be much less of an issue. And in addition, protesting and rioting would probably be more effective because it would better represent the interests of the people who are supporting it. But people don't do that. At the end of the day, there are really only two directions that you can go with this. There are really only two paths that you can take. One of them is the side where you condemn the protesters, where you will always and inevitably end up on the side of the state. If you will end up on the side of the police force, you will end up on the side of the President of the United States of America, on the side of the Conservative Party. Or you can support the protesters, in which case you will be on the side of justice. Even if the optics are poor, critiquing optics for a process for which better optics were never a reasonable option only serves the interests of your opponents. But it does show, I suppose, the actual priority of a lot of liberals who claim to otherwise support anti-racist action, right? You know? Very, very quiet, but when the rioting starts, their biggest priority is to make sure people know that they don't support burning buildings. Well, fantastic. I don't either. I think it sucks. So let's keep it from happening in the future. Let's prevent it from happening ever again. All we have to do is make sure the conditions which led to it no longer exist. As Durkheim would argue, there is utility in rioting, and we can learn from the perceived need it demonstrates. And as a final point, and I would like to make a final point here, because I have to throw out the white moderate, meme at the end of all this. Very, very important that I do so. These arguments about optics are not new. This is a little editorial back during the civil rights movement. See? It's MLK, and he says, "I plan to lead another non-violent march tomorrow." Get it? Because it doesn't look very nonviolent. Everything's on fire and what have you. Back and back. Does that mean everyone who criticizes rioting is a racist? No, I don't believe that's the case. But I do believe it is very easy to fall into the trap of implicitly supporting the oppressive forces of society by hyperfixating on the perceived optics of a sociological phenomena that is almost irrelevant when it comes to optics. So be careful with whose side you actually choose, because enlightened centristing this doesn't actually work that well. Oh shit, there was one last thing that I actually wanted to read. I completely forgot to do it. This was linked to me actually during the stream, which is pretty based in epic. It's a little bit of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. talking about protesting and rioting as a strategy. I think is pretty relevant in this case. Urban riots must now be recognized as durable social phenomena. They may be deplored, but they are there and should be understood. Urban riots are a special form of violence. They're not insurrections. The rioters are not seeking to seize territory or attain control of institutions. They are mainly intended to shock the white community. This is obviously in the context of a pretty purely racialized conflict, where I think there's more of a class element present in this current thing, but I think it's applicable nonetheless. They are a distorted form of social protest. The looting, which is their principal feature, serves many functions. It enables the most enraged and deprived Negro to take hold of consumer goods with the ease the white man does by using his purse. Often the Negro does not even want what he takes, he wants the experience of taking. But most of all, alienated from society and knowing that this society cherishes property above people, he is shocking it by abusing property rights. There are thus elements of emotional catharsis in the violent act. This may explain why most cities in which riots have occurred have not had a repetition, even though the causative condition remains. It is also noteworthy that the amount of physical harm done to white people other than the police is infinitesimal, and in Detroit, whites and Negroes looted in unity. Please don't read the N-word? Holy shit, is this seriously what you guys are focusing on? Fuck off. A profound judgment of today's riots were expressed by Victor Hugo a century ago. He said, "If a soul is left in the darkness, sins will be committed. The guilty one is not he who commits the sin, but he who causes the darkness." This is pretty much literally what I just said, except in more flowery language. The policymakers of the white society have caused the darkness, they create discrimination, they structured the slums, and they perpetuate unemployment, ignorance, and poverty. It is incontestable and deplorable that Negroes have committed crimes, but they are derivative crimes. Holy shit, I hadn't even read this, but this is like word for word what I said. They are born of the greater crimes of the white society. When we ask Negroes to abide by the law, let us also demand that the white man abide by the law in the ghettos. Day in and day out, he violates welfare laws to deprive the poor of their meager allotments. He flagrantly violates building codes and regulations. His police make a mockery of law, and he violates laws on equal employment and education and the provisions for civic services. The slums are the handiwork of a vicious system of the white society. Negroes live in them, but do not make them any more than a prisoner makes a prison. Let us say boldly that if the violations of law by the white man in the slums over the years were calculated and compared with the law-breaking of a few days of riots, the hardened criminal would be the white man. These often are difficult things to say, but I have come to see more and more that it is necessary to utter the truth in order to deal with the great problems we face in our society. People sure do like painting Martin Luther King Jr. as some kind of milquetoast liberal, but boy, oh boy, that man was a revolutionary through and through. It's a shame that after he did his best to address race issues in the country, he was killed by the government after he tried to build a working class coalition. Makes sense, though. Wasn't the only time they killed a black fellow who was doing that.